Hello.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good, I'm so pleased to be here.
So pleased to have you. Also, I love your earrings.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, I'm just moving into a new place. So I was like, where is my eyeliner? Where are my earrings? Where are the things that make me look like presentable in the Zoom era?
No, I feel you. I just moved into my new apartment. I think it's been like 3 weeks now. So like everything's still all over the place, and I'm trying to figure out like where to put what. And in that mess, I've just like lost so many things. But maybe I'll just give it like 2 more minutes, and then we can probably start.
Sure, sounds good. I love your glasses too. Where are you moving?
So I just moved to New York. I was in Connecticut for a bit, and now back to the city. So it's a little disorienting, but it's been good so far. Where are you based?
Right now I'm in Atlanta. Yeah, so I grew up here as you know, and found myself back here because of the pandemic, and then turns out like it's actually a pretty great place to live. Like it's changed a lot, as everyone now knows, over the past couple of years, and it's like a really diverse city. Like it's just very alive. You walk around and you don't feel the sort of, I don't know. I was in Iowa for 2 years, so it's like a great. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been to Atlanta twice, and I absolutely loved it. It's a great city, and yeah, I mean, I would love to go visit again. And also just to let you know and everyone else who's joining that this is also going to live on our IG page, so people are going to be able to watch it there too. But yeah, I think we can get started. I just wanted to introduce you to everyone who's watching. Sanjena Sathian is a journalist and writer. She's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, an alumni of Clarion Writers Workshop, a former Paul and Daisy Soros Fellow. Her debut novel, Gold Diggers, was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and named a Best Book of April 2021 by Bustle, Pop Sugar, Entertainment Weekly, Good Morning America, and CNN. So thank you so much for being here and joining this conversation with me and SAAG. And also congratulations on your novel. I have to say it got me out of my reading slump, so I deeply appreciate that. And it was just such a quick read. I couldn't put it down. I really enjoyed it, and it was also so touching in parts. I'm really excited to discuss it with you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I really appreciate it. And I have to say, I'm really excited that SAG exists. Like, I think a few years ago, there was just like a real dearth or just a kind of a paucity of spaces for South Asian American artists and South Asian art and, you know, reporting on like sort of real stories beyond the headlines. So I'm really,
Absolutely. And that was a big part of like why we wanted to create Saab, because we wanted to provide this platform for people who like generally don't see themselves in the media or around in creative spaces. So it was like a combination of minds that came together and were like, okay, let's create this platform that's political, that is a space for like different people who write, who like, for artists, for different people from different forms of media. So thank you for saying that. And I'm really glad we could, do this. So I really want to get into, I want to discuss your book and a couple of themes. But before that, I was wondering if you could read a short excerpt from your book. I'm sure everyone would love that.
sure. Yeah, and there's a chance if there's a glitch for a moment, it's because my phone has a bunch of built-in limits on social media. So I think I've turned them all off, but it's very possible that I might have to override one in the
Sure.
middle. So if I disappear, that's where I've gone. I will read to y'all from the second chapter of the novel. And the only thing you kind of need to know here is that the narrator, Neil Narayan, is a 15-year-old boy who's growing up in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia. And he is stuck with an older sister who is participating in a beauty pageant. So since this is a South Asian space, I thought I would read this very Desi scene that doesn't always hit with non-Desi audiences. Nothing would excuse me from attending the Miss Teen India pageant in July, which was held in the convention room of a Ramada Inn in Duluth. I'd not been forced into a kurta, but I shriveled inside to think of stepping into a lobby full of white people as a member of the Indian pageant caravan. It turned out the hotel was owned by Macy's, and the only non-Indian in sight was the paunch-bellied black security guard who kept asking, "Are y'all having some kind of festival or like traditional thing here?" The ways in which the pageant was traditional were more American than Indian. The owner of the MTI Georgia was a Gujarati businessman with beady, roving, salacious eyes, proprietor of a chain of liquor stores across Alpharetta and Gwinnett, who introduced the 20-some pageant competitors as they filed from the crimson-carpeted hallway into the yellow wallpapered room. "Give it up for our contestants, beautiful inside and out, isn't it?" he said, his vowels those mutt noises, folding in on themselves in an effort to keep the speaker from rolling the ensuing R's or clacking the T's too hard. There were perhaps 50 chairs laid out for the audience surrounding a long judge's table. About half were filled. A toddler in a gold and maroon lenga waddled laps around the seats. Some auntie leaned over me, her sequin dupatta falling on my face to say hello to my father. My mother stood in the hallway with the other mothers, armed with bobby pins and safety pins and concealer. I hadn't spotted Anita or Anjali auntie when we came in. The pageant opened with a column of brown girls balancing on spiky heels as they runway walked a makeshift stage about 2 feet off the floor. Last in line, Anita, wearing a lemon-lime, yellow and green number splattered with mirrors and tie-dye. Her whole belly was visible. It was a little soft, like an inviting pillow. This is his crush, not his sister. I realized I did not mention Anita. I caught her eye for an instant and noted nerves there in the wideness of her gaze, the way all her concentration seemed to be devoted to stilling her facial muscles. I mouthed, "Hi," then regretted it. Applause sounded, and the contestants retreated. The MTI owner was muttering to someone next to him, but the mic had not been removed from his lapels, so we all heard him hissing, "Tell that very fat one to cover up a little more." It echoed, and a shushing auntie came to unclip him while we awaited the next episode. A scrawny man manifested beside my father and pressed a pile of glossy magazines into his hand. My father, ignoring, passed them to me. They were those diaspora rags, the kind piled up in the front of Indian restaurants and salons, which stay afloat through advertisements that purvey immigrant necessities and nostalgia. An article featuring a profile on the Scripps National Spelling Bee champion, "Can you spell juggernaut? Indian Americans dominate me," running next to an advertisement for Kajol Best Ladies Fineries and Mega DC Wedding Expo, all shabby needs, Orlando, Dallas, San Jose. I flipped through and saw one of Anita's mother's catering ads. Anjali Dayal, all types Desi Khana, and a black and white picture of her that stretched her out dishonestly. Great. I've overridden. My apologies. I'll start again except from that paragraph. I flipped through and saw one of Anita's mother's catering ads. Anjali Dayal, all types Desi Khana, and a black and white picture of her that stretched her out dishonestly, making her look pleasantly plump, turning her into another safe auntie. An insert labeled "Ace College Application Season" fell out, featuring an interview with the Chinese mother who had authored the bestseller Harvard Girl. In the back, a column ran from a Hindu activist under the headline, "We must be more like the Jews." My father prodded the college insert. "Keep that aside." I did. Later, I would find it contained a workbook to help you build your college essay Mad Lib style. My dream is, when not studying, my most important experience between ages 10 and 18 was, there were the question and answer sessions during which the ladies skirmished to offer the inanest possible response to that platitudinous question and its many manifestations. What did it mean to be both Indian and American? To wit, how should this generation adjust to the new country? Prachi faltered, trying to explain why we didn't speak an Indian language at our house. My mother, speaks about 6 languages, and my father too, but when they moved here, they wanted us to only learn English. Better was Uma Parthasari's response to a question posed by Judge Manisha Fruitwala. Miss Uma, which place would you most like to visit and why? For me, to therapy, because God has been very calling on me recently. There were the talents, too often Bollywood-infused hip-hop or Kathak-infused tap. Prerna Malik, 15, of Clay County, was the highlight of that year's program, as she twirled a folded umbrella about like a cane to some old filmy monsoon song, which subsided into Singin' in the Rain. As the English interrupted the Hindi, Prerna snapped open the umbrella to face us. Ah, the instrument! It was patterned in the colors of the Indian flag. She rotated it in front of her, legs lifting into many chubby rocket kicks. Then she began to do Kathak chukkers, twirling and twirling to a beat not audible within Singin' in the Rain. Finally, Prerna set down her umbrella, stumbled, covered her mouth, and ran out of the room, having dizzied herself into nausea. A few people followed her anxiously into the hallway. The judges went on making notes. The audience kept elbowing each other, eyeing the glossies, undertaking college application mad libs. And my father began to emit deep ursine snores.
That was delightful. Thank you so much. I also loved the different voices. They really brought it to life. And I'm really glad you started with this because I think it easily leads into one of the questions I wanted to ask you is that, a big part of your novel deals with ambition. That's kind of like a through line that runs through it. And usually when you think about immigrant novels, it's like you think about how people came here, they put their head down, they worked hard, they kind of just went through the motions and didn't ask any questions. And that, I loved how you approached it in this novel where it's like very different. You look at people born and raised here and how they deal with it. And you almost also question that sometimes extreme ambition is, not to give anything away, but not the best thing. So I wanted to ask you a little more about that and like walk us through the process of how you thought of that, and were you drawing a little bit from your own life and experiences?
Yeah, of course I was. Yeah, I mean, I didn't start writing this book thinking I'm going to write a critique of ambition or write about the model minority myth, even though that's kind of the language that has kind of come out in reviews and in marketing of the book. But, like most writers, I started with a story, and I started with something that was quite far away from kind of the social message that the book, I think, eventually does take on. I just started with this idea that there would be a mother and a daughter who would steal gold. They would be sort of pariahs in the Indian American community that is very, has a lot of norms where everyone in this corner, they're dominant caste, Hindu, upper middle class, in, straight marriages, like everything in boxes. And so what would it be like to, maybe have a mother and a daughter who fell outside that box and broke some rules? And it was almost like I just inevitably had to tell a story that was about the rules if I was going to tell a story of someone breaking those rules. And pretty quickly, I had this conceit of gold theft, but in order to fill it out, I just started writing the world that I knew best, which is the world that I grew up in. The world that I grew up in was suffused with ambition, and very, very kind of uncritical and unthinking ambition very often. It was just, you have to succeed in this very, very narrow conception of success because that's what we came here for. That's why we moved here. That's a lot of pressure, and it also, more than anything, it's kind of morally bereft. And as you said, that has consequences over the course of the book because it's valueless, it's empty.
Right. And, you mentioned gold, and that is something that I wanted to get into because I loved how you used assets and the importance that gold is given in the Indian community, which it felt like, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but it almost felt like a little secret between, Indian Americans and Indians reading this book who kind of know about the value versus like people outside the community who might not know too much about how much value gold has, going in. So I wanted to ask you a little more about kind of why you chose to do that. And then I guess in a way, when you were thinking about the book, were you trying to get away from certain tropes as you wrote this novel? And there's not a lot of explaining that you did. So, personally, it was extremely refreshing. So like, I was curious about your thought process around that.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that. It's something that's really, it's so hard, and I think about this all the time when I'm reading work by friends of color, by students of color, because this is like one of the major questions we face, right? Is what before we even sit down to write, who is the audience? How much can we take for granted? Are we gonna have in jokes and then the mainstream message? Like, is your text supposed to function on all of these levels? And I think I was just so absorbed in the storytelling that I wasn't thinking too much about explanation. And I let the sort of explanation come pretty late. So I had questions from people on my publishing team about like the nature of gold, why it was so important, around like the rules of the magic, because the gold takes on a magical conceit. I had all those questions later, and I clarified where I needed to, but for the most part, because I hadn't entered the story saying, I'm going to make this, you know, legible to someone on the outside, it was first like an internally coherent story. And then I was okay to answer the questions that I thought were worth answering. The other thing that I really appreciated about my publishing team is, you know, my publicist is Asian American. We have a really awesome Indian American woman who works in the marketing of it, who read the book when Penguin Press was looking at acquiring it. And my editor is not Daisy, but is incredibly thoughtful about, you know, there were moments where she would flag in the text, would be like, I actually think you're explaining this for a non-Indian reader, and I think you should let this be in the text because that's not how these characters would talk to each other. So I think even though publishing has a long way to go, like I was really lucky to work with people who have taken for granted some of these values that we're talking about. A text has to function as art in and of its own right. It's not there to be didactic, and that's what happens when we're obsessed with explaining. As we get worse art, we get didactic instructional art, and that's restrictive.
That's an excellent point. And, you know, you brought up two things that I really want to get into. The first is you mentioned magic, which, you know, I thought it was such a great way to explain kind of everything that was happening in the world of the novel. And there are not too many examples of magical realism in, you know, Indian literature. I mean, Saman Rushdie comes to mind, but apart from that, there's not too much. So I was curious if you kind of fell into this just as you were writing. You were like, oh, maybe this is something I can explore. Or was it something that right off the bat you were like, I want to do something that not a lot of people in this community are doing?
It was mostly just that that's what I was writing for a few years. And I did have periods where I was like, I just can't read the work of writers who are demographically exactly like me, because it felt too difficult to, I was like, this is the way to write a brown book. Like I read Rushdie and I was like, hey, this is how you write a brown book. I read Arundhati Roy. I was like, this is how you write a brown book. And those are writers who I love, but I actually needed to take space away. And so I think in taking space away and just reading a lot of non-Indian literature and non-Indian American literature, I just found new tools. And then when I kind of came back to you know, the artistic community that I do belong to, I came with different tools. And I just think that's a really important thing to be able to do, is to read people who are like you and unlike you, and like to be really crass about it, to steal what you need to steal from different worlds. And so I was reading a lot of Kelly Link and Miranda July and George Saunders. I've always had sort of an intense relationship with Japanese literature and with the Latin American magical realists. And the way magic operates in some of those works is it's very light. Like it doesn't break the reality of the story. I think of like Banana Yoshimoto, or, you know, Cortázar. Like these are writers for whom magic was part of the fabric of the reality of the worlds they were building. And so it's different than how we think of it in like American high fantasy or, you know, hard sci-fi. It's just a different set of tools. Yeah.
Absolutely. That sounds great, and that makes a lot of sense. And that kind of, I guess, in a way, leads into the second part of what I wanted to ask you, which you also kind of touched upon in your previous answer. I remember reading an article that you recently wrote, I think for The Drift, which is on like diasporic writers and kind of some of the tropes they fall into. And I loved it. And there was a quote in that article, I think, let me just pull it up. You said, but in the tokenistic literary world, Lahiri still occupies the singular throne set aside for Indian Americans. This line really stayed with me because so I was born and raised in India, and I moved here only 6 years ago. And I remember when I was in India, like when I read books by Indian American authors, a lot of them followed very similar thread. And sometimes I would be like, I feel like this is not written for me. And I mean, in a way, like, I think I wasn't sure what to make of it, given that I wasn't raised in the US. So I was like, maybe I'm just missing something. But then I moved here and, I read a little more and I was like, I think it was actually written for a different audience. And so I'm really curious about your thought process, because it seems like that's something you definitely thought about while you were writing this book. And so how did you work through your novel to maybe avoid that? Were you worried about this falling into some trope or like explaining too much to people?
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like a constant anxiety, right? When we're making things, it's like there's this battle between like maybe you feel artistic freedom when you're actually sitting down to type or write, but then you take a step away and immediately like, I'm sorry, does anyone want to read a novel? Like, I had a lot of anxiety about the narrator Neil being sort of like a badly behaved teen boy who's sort of like an everyman. I was like, maybe people expect me to write like very somber women who are gazing out of windows and in like loveless marriages and like musing upon the old country, which I think is the kind of trope of a lot of immigrant literature, and particularly Indian American literature. And as I write about in that essay, it's not entirely Lahiri's fault that she was elevated to just being this like singular voice, like on behalf of the South Asian diaspora. But I think more than anything, I wasn't trying to write against tropes so much as just writing the book that it's the only kind of book I could have written. It's the book that's to my taste stylistically. Something broke open in me in college when I read White Teeth by Zadie Smith, which was totally seminal for me. When I read Roth later, I think like fairly late, actually in my mid-20s. When I read Hanif Qureshi, who is the sort of other voice that I discussed in that essay that you very kindly read. And these are writers who are like irreverent. They understand that like nostalgia is an emotion that is legitimate and we can engage with it and it's a component of art, but it's not like the overwhelming sort of like saccharine tone that I think that can take on. And I just think irreverence is like the way that I formed my identity. So it's the only way I could write this book. But it's just that way in which aesthetics are intensely personal, and we just have to have space for as many of them as possible instead of just preferring a single one.
Yeah, that's great. And like I mentioned earlier, it was something I really appreciated, that I didn't feel like someone was holding my hand and walking me through different things when I read the book. And a couple of my friends who are not Indian also read the book, and it clearly was a situation where they're like, we didn't really need that explaining. So I'm glad it exists, and I'm glad more and more people are starting to write such books. And I wanted to get into a couple of things that are a little different from your book. But before I do that, the last question I did want to ask you related to Gold Diggers was, I want to talk a little bit about the ending. I don't want to give anything away to anybody, but I'm, as someone who kind of I'm as a journalist, I often think that the beginnings and the endings are the hardest things to do. And your ending parts of it were, you didn't do the typical, like, let me tie a bow on everything perfectly. There were some parts which were a little ambiguous that pulled into the magical realism. I'm trying to be as vague as I can because I don't want to spoil anything. But I was also curious about that process. Like when you went into writing this book, you mentioned that you were thinking of a daughter and a mother, but did you already know how this would end or where this would lead?
I didn't really. The book is about gold, and there are mythologies that infuse the book that helped me think about structure. So like the tale of King Midas is one that we all often know. And people think about, oh, the tale of King Midas, he touched everything, everything turned to gold, that was the curse. There is an ending to the Midas story that always sort of occupied me and haunted me, and I kept turning it over and over again. And it has to do with Midas getting rid of the curse by dipping his hands in a river. And a river turns out to be an important component of the ending of the book. And that, I had that image in my head, and I was like, maybe it would be cool to write toward this image of a river. I don't know where I'll find the river. I don't know how it will play into the rules of the magic. I don't know if I'll write into or write against the Midas tale, but that was going to be something to sort of write towards. And then I thought a lot about other books' endings that I loved. So I think Gatsby has probably the most perfect ending. I know it's kind of trite at this point, but it means so much to me because I read it in 10th grade, and it was like the book that made sense of America for me. I also thought a lot about A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki, which is a sort of, it has magic in it and it has multiple perspectives.
It's one of my favorite books.
I love it. I feel like not enough people have read it. Yeah.
I want to be her. Like, she's amazing.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that book is so amazing because it's, it's the story of a teenager, it's teenage diary, and then a woman in Japan, a Japanese teenager's diary, and then a woman in Canada who's basically a stand-in for the author who finds the diary. And so she's got this incredibly difficult task of how do you reconcile these two worldviews. But then on top of that, there are all these like ideas infusing the book, right? As you know, there's Buddhism, there's like Heideggerian concepts of time, and then there's like this drama of this teenager's well-being, and then the author's, all of these things, and you're like, how are you going to land this plane, lady? And she finds the way to do it by going a little off kilter, like a little asymmetric. So I think sometimes it just helps to be like, what are endings I admire, and like, how do I make the structures of those work for my project?
That makes sense. And this is just a side note, but throughout, like, until I was in college, I used to, every time I wanted to buy a book, I would always turn to the last page and read the last few sentences. People think that ruins the book, but it doesn't, because usually people don't spoil the ending in the last sentence. But if a book ends well, I know I want to read it. It's a thing that I've always had since I was a kid, but I still kind of do it sometimes. But I just have a couple more questions, but I wanted to move a little away from the book and talk more about your process. So as a journalist myself, like, this is a curiosity that I've had about people who are, have written as a journalist as well as like, fiction. What happens, I guess, in your mind, like when you're thinking about something, you're making something up from your imagination versus when you're thinking about a long form feature, maybe where there's like hours of reporting, you talk to a lot of people. How does the process differ, and are there any similarities in it?
I think the big similarity that like journalists have, like the thing that journalists and novelists have in common, I would say certain kinds of journalists, not everyone is like this, but I think you like learn, like I really think it's like an ethics and an orientation toward the world that you develop as a journalist. Like if you're really like a curious person, if you're not just doing it like to log time and publish the quickie articles, you learn to sort of always be filtering the world through like deep curiosity. And I think that's just an intensely valuable way to approach the world. And it's like the same kind of orientation that you have if you've just been an outsider in the world. And like, that's, I think, one of the things that I loved about being a journalist. I wasn't a very good one, but I did like that I could sort of just look at the world and be like, wow, there's so much that I don't understand. If I go to someone and I ask hard questions, like in this job, they might answer me. I might be able to unfurl something about how people relate to this confusing place. And I do think some novelists are like that too. Fiction for me though was like the more comfortable process. Like it's not like one is easier than the other. It's just what I most natively do. I always really wanted to write fiction, and I think there would be moments when I was a reporter when I would be you know, out talking to someone and I would be like feeling really lazy, be like, my energy is flagging. I just want to go home and like not have to talk to any more humans. And surely that's justified because I can imagine the internal landscape of these people. I know what the story is. And so that's the way in which, like, being a reporter, it definitely gave me access to other people's worlds, but also gave me the instinct to be like, maybe I'm more interested in like very private parts of people that they just like aren't going to reveal to me and might like aren't relevant to the stories that I'm doing. Like, I was a tech reporter. I wasn't like doing like, maybe if I were like really good enough to be like a New Yorker reporter or like, you know, something like that, maybe, but I was not there.
I mean, I don't doubt that you'd be good. I mean, this book was incredible. So, you know, I was also curious about. I mean, again, if this is something you are, you know, not privy to talk about, you don't have to. But I was curious if your next steps, are you thinking of staying in the world of like fiction and novels, or are you, you know, maybe gonna keep reporting, keep doing other nonfiction things?
I don't think I'll ever have like a full-time job in journalism again. That was, for me, that really was kind of a holding pattern, and it wasn't for me long term. But I think I learned so much from that I could see myself doing some kind of creative nonfiction project that involves reporting or research. Like, just like, it's a skill that you don't lose. So I could see myself coming back to that. In some form, but probably more book length or essay style. Like, I'm working on some essays, but I'm working on like some screenwriting stuff and fiction and essay stuff now, not as much reporting anymore.
Oh yeah, I mean, I should have mentioned right in the beginning, but you know, it's so exciting the news about Mindy Kaling turning this into a series. How did I mean? I again, like, you know, I don't know how much you could talk about this, but like, how did that come about? And like, are you involved in the process at all, or is it okay? Oh, great, okay.
Yeah, I'm working on it right now. Actually, I'm co-writing the adaptation with like more experienced in screenwriting showrunner, who is like a really exciting person to work with. We haven't like announced anything about collaboration yet, but we're sort of getting off the ground. The way it came about is just that my agent went to Hollywood with the book at the same time she went to publishers, and I think that's like a more commonly trod path these days. Like, there's just a more symbiotic relationship between LA and New York than I had ever really realized, because people are hungry for stories, and like, here's a book that's already, the story's done, the world is done, now you can make with it what you want. So we just got really lucky that Mindy and her team connected with it. Yeah, it's been
Awesome. And it looks like there's a question from Kamil. He asked, if you were a different kind of reporter, say, would you approach narrative differently with nonfiction?
I don't think I totally understand the question. Sorry.
I think I think if I understood the question correctly, it seems like, do you like, would you approach a story like this through a nonfiction narrative? Maybe I got that wrong, but yeah.
I think that narrative like functions really differently in nonfiction. Like, there is space for ambiguity in nonfiction, but there's a little less space, and I don't even mean like it's like pretty clear what's happening page by page in this book. Like, this is not like, it's not like a stream of consciousness like Wolfian thing. But I think there's like a gray space of like where people stand morally, where the book stands in relation to something morally. It's a lot more interested in like deep private life that some really amazing like creative nonfiction new journalism people really can do, but that just wasn't ever what I did as a writer.
Yeah, I think he clarified saying if you were not a tech reporter and I'm another kind of reporter.
Yeah. I mean, like, I love the book Three Women by Lisa Teo, that I might be mispronouncing her last name, but it's like it's nonfiction, but it's so close that you basically feel like you're inside the sort of lives and sexuality of these women. There are so many books that are written like that. but that's a good example. Like, if I had the diligence to spend years with people, like really getting to know them and then removing myself from the story, I would totally do that. But I think I'm also too self-important to like erase myself from the story.
Well, I just have one more question for you. And I was wondering if like, I think this is something that you touched upon in your article for The Drift, but do you worry personally that now that you've written a book that is linked to the Indian diaspora, that you like kind of fall into this bucket of like being known as someone who only writes those kind of stories? Or is this a worry that you even have? Is this something you want to embrace?
No, totally. It's definitely a worry. But it's part of the reason that, I was like very active on social media for like the first month of my tour, and I have been pulling back a little. I had to like delete 10 different blocks to even open Instagram today. And as you saw, one of them still came through. I actually think that's because so much of the boxing in happens in the marketing machine, because editors who are assigning things to writers, assigning their books reporter what to cover. Like, you have to find a way to categorize people. I was journalist. We know how this happens. You have to find a way. You have to find the angle into the story, and so the story of any new author often is tied to, this is this person writing their community, or this is this person articulating their personal experience in fiction. And I think that's like a necessary component of talking about a book publicly. But I think if I lingered in it too long, I was going to prevent myself from ever being able to write again, which is why I have been taking some space away. So that's the big way I can do it. And then in the end, I'm alone in a room with my books, and not like the books I wrote, like the books behind me that I like to read. And then all of a sudden, like, identity can become more malleable. But I do think like the book industry makes it really hard for us to think of ourselves as like artists and creators alone. It makes us think of ourselves as, I'm an Indian artist, I'm a Muslim artist. Like, it forces that onto people, when sometimes you need to have the flexibility to be sometimes Indian, sometimes just artist, sometimes both.
That makes sense. This reminds me actually of an interview that Sola from Bon Appetit had given with on a podcast. I think it was A Minute with Sam Sanders, and she talks about this like siloing of people into these groups. Like, if you are an Indian chef, you're always expected to make Indian food instead of trying like different food, whether it be like French or Persian or anything else. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense about, putting people in boxes and being right to do that. But
time, like Toni Morrison wrote, Blackness her whole life. Roth wrote like Jewish Americans his whole life, and it didn't restrict. Like, I'm not going to pull a jumpa and like move to Italy and stop writing about brown people. Like, that's of zero interest to me.
I'm glad, because I'm excited for whatever you write next, and I will definitely be reading it. But this was great. Thank you so much for taking time on your Monday evening to talk to us. It was so enlightening. I love the book, and I'm glad we got a chance to talk about it. And I'm sure all our viewers and anyone who's going to watch it on our Instagram is also going to learn a lot from this. So thank you, and I will let you get back to your day, and I hope you have a great one.
Thanks for having me. This is great. Bye.